It's the 17th of July, 1918. World War I is almost over, but just off of Land's End, a legend is dying. Carpathia, a small Cunard liner built in 1903, had been torpedoed twice, and her bow is low in the water awaiting swallowing by the East Atlantic Ocean. Listing hard over to the port side, Carpathia has been resisting her fate for at least an hour now, but her attacker isn't finished. U-55, the submarine that torpedoed her twice at least an hour beforehand, surfaces and fires one more torpedo into the liner. Carpathia's fate is sealed. Although small, she resisted her fate for almost 2 hours, but 3 torpedoes was enough to sink even the largest liners of the day. But Carpathia isn't even close to the largest ship in the world, and is comparably tiny. At 11 a.m. ship's time, Carpathia is gone, with her 5 lives. 218 people have been rescued by the British sloop called the HMS Snowdrop. After the rescue, her survivors are taken back to Liverpool to arrive there the next day on the 18th of July. Carpathia is the 5th Cunarder sunk in a matter of weeks. But how did this liner come to be? Well, in this video, we're going to be taking a full tour of Carpathia's history, from the moment she was designed to the moment that she sank. Cunard Line was a massive company, always getting delivered ships that were constantly breaking records. In 1893, they were delivered the Carpathia and the Lucania, the largest and fastest ships in the world, but then, in 1897, the Norddeutsche Lloyd Line were delivered the new largest and fastest ship in the world, the SS Kaiser Wilhelm der Grosse. It didn't help that White Star Line was testing out a new strategy to make more profit, and in doing so had also built the largest ship in the world, the RMS Oceanic of 1899. Carpathia and Lucania were now outdated, and now considerably smaller than the largest ships in the world. So Cunard would order new liners. Ever so slightly bigger than the Carpathia class, but not nearly big enough to be the largest ship in the world. No. This time, Cunard's new trio wouldn't be the biggest or the fastest ships in the world, and probably not even close to the most luxurious ships in the world either. But they were built to be enough of these to make Cunard a profit. A trio of ships were delivered. They were not to be very fast, and they were designed for use in immigrant travel. The first one was laid down in the Swan Hunter shipyard and launched in 1899. She had her maiden voyage the same year, and this ship, named Ivernia, was a great success. The second sister ship was not laid down in the Swan Hunter shipyard. Instead, the John Brown shipyard. This ship was launched after Ivernia's maiden voyage, and this ship's name would be Saxonia. She had her maiden voyage on the 22nd of May, 1900, and like Ivernia, it was a massive success. The third ship would be a little bit different. Her yard number was 274 for the Swan Hunter shipyard. The third liner would be 12 meters shorter than Ivernia and Saxonia, and as a result, about 700 tons smaller. This ship would be named after a mountain range in Central Europe, the Carpathian Mountains. This ship's name would be Carpathia. After completion, Carpathia was a marvel. Her dining saloon was described as being decorated in cream and gold. Her second-class accommodations were comfortable and stylish, with a library and a walnut-paneled smoke room. She was designed smaller than her sisters, or half-sisters, depending on which way you look at it, Ivernia and Saxonia, but was just as luxurious. Her lower decks were well ventilated, and she was fully decked out with over 2,000 lamps, though if they failed, she still had an excess supply of oil lamps. As for her propulsion systems, Carpathia was equipped with 7 single-ended boilers, which were equipped with a Howden draught system, working at 210 psi, powering two four-cylinder quadruple expansion engines connecting to two propellers, pushing the ship at around 15 knots. As proved during the ship's sea trials in 1903, anyways. Carpathia could handle up to 1,700 passengers, and in 1903 made her way to Liverpool for her maiden voyage. She would be put on the Boston route and left on her maiden voyage on the 5th of May 1903, and she would end up being just as successful as her sisters. She was described as a comfortable ship, not fast and not large, but that wasn't Cunard's goal. Cunard's goal was profit, which the three sister ships proudly and very easily made. The ship was also exceptionally comfortable during rough weather, as she had a high breadth to length ratio, and so was less prone to rolling. Cunard was proud of Carpathia. In the summer, she was on the Boston route, and in the winter, the Mediterranean route. In 1904, Cunard partnered up with the Royal Hungarian Sea Navigation Company, and thus Carpathia was now expected to carry large amounts of Hungarian immigrants. It was clear Carpathia needed a bit of a refit for this, though, and so in 1905 she was laid up and refitted. And the refit was successful. Her capacity was no longer 1,700 passengers, it was now 2,500 passengers, a 47% increase. Her small third-class rooms were converted to fairly large dormitories, and some areas that were previously second-class were converted to brand-new first-class cabins. Carpathia was now about 13,600 tons. Carpathia was back in 1905 and better than ever, more luxurious, and had a higher carrying capacity. She was immensely successful and massively profitable for the company, but she was soon overshadowed by some brand new liners. Coronia and Carmania were new, bigger, and better liners than Carpathia, Ivernia, and Saxonia, but the Coronia class was much like the Ivernia class. They weren't meant to be the biggest ships in the world, and they weren't meant to be the fastest ships in the world. They were equipped with different engines to test out an engine configuration for two massive future liners. Lusitania and Mauretania were the largest ships in the world. They were not like the previous two classes. They were meant to be the most luxurious, the biggest, and the fastest. And they achieved all of this with ease. Carpathia was now seen as a small liner, and compared to the Lusitania class, was tiny and slow, but that didn't stop people from loving her. Carpathia was still profitable and well liked. It was in April of 1912 that her first incident occurred, and I think most of you can tell where this is going. Carpathia left New York for the Mediterranean on April 11th, 1912, bound for Austria-Hungary. The night of the 14th was calm. Carpathia's wireless operator, Harold Cottam, was on the bridge off duty. By now it was the early morning of the 15th of April, and Cottam went back down to the wireless shack and took a listen before he went to bed, and it was a bit of a mess, and Cottam was presumably awakened by this. He had received a distress call. Quote, "Come at once. We have struck a berg. It's a CQD, old man." Coming from the Titanic. He rushed out of the wireless shack and ran back up to the bridge asking where Captain Rostron was, only to be answered by, quote, "He turned in for the night." Cottam wouldn't take this. He ran back down to Mr. Rostron's cabin and was followed by one of the officers trying to get him to stop, but he wouldn't. He barged into Rostron's room and awakened him. Now, Rostron was originally furious with Cottam, asking, quote, "Haven't you ever heard of knocking?" Before Cottam told Rostron that they were in a tough situation, and that they got a wireless message from the Titanic saying that they were sinking. After assuring Rostron of this, the captain escorted them out of the room, saying to Cottam to tell them that they were heading there at once, and to ask for their position. Rostron was back on the bridge in an instant. He ordered the engines to go as fast as they would safely go. It was believed that Carpathia's top speed was 15 knots, incredibly slow for the time, but the engines were pushed more and more until they were not safely able to be run. 15 knots passed, 16 knots passed, before finally a 17-knot speed, the fastest Carpathia could really safely go, and the fastest speed it would ever go, before and since. But there was a problem. The Titanic was sinking quickly, and they were both in the middle of the North Atlantic Ocean, and Carpathia was 60 miles away. With the rate that they were going, even if it was Carpathia's speed record, it would take them hours to get there, an estimated 4 hours. But Rostron didn't care. There was a ship 10 miles from Titanic that wasn't doing anything, and Carpathia was the next closest ship. Rostron wouldn't give up. He ordered all of the gangway doors to be prepared and as many hot food and drinks as possible to be prepared. They were expecting 1 to 2,000 people on board, and they needed as many preparations as possible. Rostron also ordered the ship's heating supply to mostly be completely doused, so they could save as much steam as possible for when they took on the survivors. Carpathia was going so fast, for her anyways, she nearly had the same fate as Titanic just a couple hours later, in the sense that she nearly sideswiped an iceberg. On their way, it wasn't entirely known where they would have to stop. They would have to rely on the Marconi set for that, and of course, their naked eyes. But then Rostron and his crew saw a green flare coming from the middle of the ocean. He knew this was one of two things: either Titanic dead in the water, or one of her boats. And it was one of her boats. Boat 2. At 4 a.m. ship's time, Carpathia's engines were stopped, and at 4:10 they started taking on survivors, when there was a horrifying realization. Titanic's officer Boxall was taken aboard Carpathia, and he started openly weeping, saying that Titanic was gone. Carpathia was expecting 1 to 2,000 passengers, but horrifically only took on 712. 1,496 were lost in the sinking of Titanic. Carpathia's boats were swung in, and she picked up 13 of Titanic's boats. By around 8 a.m., another ship came on scene. It was the IMM's Leyland Liner, Californian. There was a realization, though. Californian was the liner that was 10 miles away from Titanic, and Californian, with their radio now on, told their story on why they didn't come, and if there was anything they could do, but Cottam said no. That everything could be done had already been done. Californian still looked, though, but of course to no avail for survivors. Carpathia left around 9 a.m. and her captain consulted with Joseph Ismay, the chairman of the White Star Line, who also survived the disaster, on where they would dock. One option was the Azore Islands. Another was Halifax. But it was ultimately decided that New York, Titanic's original destination, and where Carpathia originally departed from, would be the best port to dock at. Carpathia turned around and headed back to New York. It was torture on board. Titanic's junior operator Bride was helping operator Cottam with sending out messages with 2 casted feet. An upside-down lifeboat had landed on Bride, and he had to swim out. People had hypothermia and needed to be heated in an instant. There was no survivor of the Titanic that wasn't in real need of heat. One passenger even died on the trip to New York. Carpathia was now carrying double of her original complement, 1,400 passengers, though as stated before, she could easily accommodate these people now. The ship's dining rooms were all quickly converted to medical areas. A few days later, in rainy weather, Carpathia arrived in New York at 9:25 p.m. on the 18th of April. She briefly docked in the White Star Line Pier 54, a rare occasion to see a non-White Star Liner in their piers, let alone a liner from an opposing company. She dropped off the Titanic's lifeboats and then backed out to make their way to Pier 59, the Cunard Line pier. People had many hours to get off, and they did, but many not easily. This photo was taken of Operator Bride leaving the Carpathia in two casted feet and crutches, and it was a horrifying and disturbing sight for many. People asking where their loved ones were, only not to get an answer. People were looking all around the piers and docks and buildings around just to never find them. Only some lucky families entirely survived, and it was not easy trying to find people who have found their loved ones. Many found one, or some, or not at all, and people were openly breaking down. Carpathia was now more famous than when she was built, and whether or not it was thought possible was arguably more famous than the Lusitania and the Mauretania. Captain Rostron was given a big trophy by one of Titanic's survivors, Mrs. Margaret Brown, to thank him for his bravery and his prosperity to the survivors in the water and in the boats. Carpathia became so famous that an underwater mountain was named the Carpathian Seamount. No, not named after the Central European mountain range, named after the small Cunard Liner. Rostron got an additional medal from the government of the United States with the U.S. Congressional Gold Medal. After Carpathia dropped off the survivors of Titanic and one of its original passengers, it headed back on its original route, heading to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, modern-day Croatia, though probably on a sorrier and quieter note. Carpathia was one of the most famous Cunard liners up to that point now, and would end up being one of the most famous Cunard liners in history. The 1913 season was fairly uneventful for Carpathia, though she was presumably very successful on this season. But in 1914, World War I started, and Carpathia was requisitioned and called into service. Her funnel was painted a wartime gray. For the majority of the war, she transported Canadian and American expeditionary forces to Europe. She was often in convoys with other ships, and often the leader of the convoy, as she was usually the biggest ship. On the 15th of July, 1918, Carpathia departed Liverpool in a convoy, heading for Boston, with 57 passengers and 166 crew, traveling with 6 other ships and an escort, and she and the other ships in the convoy were taking action as usual and taking escape maneuvers, a zigzag course. On the 17th of July, the escort left, cutting the convoy in half. Carpathia was now the largest ship in the convoy, so she once again assumed the role of the lead Commodore ship. She was off Land's End, still in the convoy, when a line in the water was spotted at 9:15 a.m. off the port bow. It could only mean one thing: a torpedo. Captain Prothero of Carpathia ordered full speed astern and hard to starboard, but it was far too late. An explosion rocked the Carpathia, with a spray of water rising up under cargo hold number 3. 2 of the ship's lifeboats also broke off their lines and fell off the side of the ship. But before long, a second torpedo rocked the ship with another spray of water, this time at the engine room, killing 3 stokers and 2 trimmers. Carpathia was under attack. As they tried to speed away, they realized something. Carpathia's steering gear had been knocked out, and the ship was quickly taking on water. The second torpedo also struck right at the engine room, meaning one of the most important rooms on the ship, the room that could effectively make Carpathia a working ship, was flooding and failing. The second explosion also badly damaged the electrical gear, meaning that her wireless apparatus was almost unusable, and so Prothero flagged the other ships in the convoy, and they sped away at full speed to protect themselves. Carpathia fired rockets in the air to alert patrol ships nearby that they were under attack. Her engines were almost completely inoperable, and they knew U-boats were still in the area. Carpathia started creaking and groaning and began to have a slight list to port. The order was given to fill the boats but not launch them yet. Prothero still wanted to make an attempt to escape, but it was no use. Carpathia was venting steam, and her engines were inoperable. She had quite a considerable list to port now, and she started to settle by the head, so Prothero ordered the abandoned ship signal, and the lifeboats were launched. Carpathia's bow had now settled by the head and was swallowed by the Atlantic Ocean, and while almost every other passenger and crew member disembarked Carpathia on the 11 boats that they had, Captain Prothero, the chief officer, the first officer, and the second officer all stayed on board the sinking ship. Her power was out, her convoy was gone, and she was dead in the water. Her top-ranked crew made it their mission to stay on the half-sunk Carpathia and to make sure that all confidential books, documents, papers, and any of that stuff were thrown overboard. By now, Carpathia was about to take her final plunge. The once grand Cunard Liner, a huge moneymaker, was being cut down to size. Before the bridge went under, her captain flagged down one of her boats to make them come aside, and they did so. Her crew evacuated the ship, and now, apart from the 5 dead souls inside, she was completely evacuated. But her attacker wasn't done. Her attacker was the German submersible U-55. Now, U-55 torpedoed Carpathia twice, but they still had another torpedo. They aimed towards the sinking liner, and her superstructure was going under, and Carpathia was about to take her final plunge. Then one more torpedo left the submarine. This third and final explosion was heard and felt throughout the ship. It opened up the hull and let in more water throughout the ship. After this, the British sloop Snowdrop arrived on scene, and just in time to see Carpathia's plunge, and to see U-55 approaching the boats in the water. Well, the crew of the Snowdrop immediately took action, and with gunfire approached the U-55, who dived and managed to escape. Her gangways were open, and the 218 survivors were led on board. Carpathia had resisted her fate for almost 2 hours now, but at 11 a.m., Carpathia plunged to the ocean floor. It had been an hour and 45 minutes after the first torpedo explosion. Just 2 hours earlier, a decently sized Grand Liner had been sailing with a convoy. Now that convoy had taken evasive maneuvers, sailed away at top speed, and that same decently sized Grand Liner was now a wreck on the ocean floor. Snowdrop arrived back in Liverpool on the 18th of July, and the survivors disembarked. It had turned out that Carpathia had been the 5th Cunarder sunk in just weeks. Carpathia had also suffered the same tragic fate as her sister, or half-sister, Ivernia. Ivernia had been sunk by U-47 on the 1st of January, New Year's Day, 1917, just a year and a half earlier, under the command of Captain William Turner. No, not that William Turner. That William Turner. Along with Carpathia and Ivernia, many other Cunard ships were lost in the war due to the same reasons. Of the 3 Grand Liners dreamt up in 1898, only one of them survived the war, the Saxonia. She returned to service in 1919 and had a successful career before she was finally scrapped in 1925. Carpathia remained a wreckage off the coast of the British Isles, and in 1999, it was thought that Carpathia's wreck was found, though it was determined to be the Hamburg America liner Isis, sunk in 1936. Later the next year, in 2000, her wreck was actually found by the organization called NUMA, or NUMA. Carpathia is in about 600 feet of water and upright, much like the Titanic wreck found just 15 years earlier. Only Titanic is obviously much deeper than the Carpathia. Today, Carpathia is known for her heroic actions on the morning of the 15th of April, 1912. But what happened to Arthur Rostron, her captain at the time? Well, Rostron lived a healthy life afterwards and ended up commanding many ships. In total, the list of ships he commanded were the Pannonia, the Carpathia, the Carmania, the Lusitania, the Campania, the Urania, the Mauretania, the Andania, the Saxonia, and the Berengaria. He died at the age of 71 in 1940.